this month, maybe on the 15th, but today is kind of our last opportunity to kind of look at the situation that's going on in Latin America, generally speaking. So we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. David Smilde to talk about the current crisis in Venezuela. He is the Charles A. and Leo M. Favreau Professor of Human Relations at Tulane University. He's a senior fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America. He's editor-in-chief of the Journal of Colloquium Sociology and curates the blog Venezuelan Politics and Human Rights. He's spent, over the last 15 years, he's spent actually more time in Venezuela than he's spent in the United States. He's kind of a first-hand appreciation of what's going on in the country. So this is our end of our October colloquium here in the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Initiative. And join me in welcoming Dr. David Smith.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Professor Roper and as well as for the invitation to give this lecture, and as well as Tulane Chancellor for doing the organizational work. It's a real pleasure to be here and speaking in the Peace and Justice and Human Rights Initiative. Okay, today I'm going to talk about human rights advocacy. Obviously, you all have heard about it. It's in the news frequently because of its human rights crisis. Now, I'm a sociology professor at Tulane University, but I'm also a resident. Lived there most. I've had as such, beyond just intention, human rights advocacy, just I'm a consultant. For the most part, I work on analyzing country conditions, the conditions of human rights, and what conditions human rights advocates face in advocating for human rights. The main organization I work for is the Washington Office on Latin America, where I'm a senior fellow. I curate a blog for them called Venezuelan Politics and Human Rights. On this blog, my colleagues tend to analyze the day-to-day issues. We're publishing, and we're always looking very close to the ground at what's going on. So for invitations like this one, what I like to do is try and take a step back and think about a little bit more systematically about human rights and human rights advocacy in places like Venezuela, because it's not just Venezuela. This is the type of situation that's happening around the world. Venezuela, Turkey, and indeed our own country. Some of these issues are unfortunately becoming important as well. Okay, so perhaps the first most important point is that human rights advocacy always takes place in a particular context within a particular political. Venezuela is an important governing projects. And that's because there's a particular bias built into traditional political rights. And human rights advocacy, as traditionally seeks to protect citizens from the power of government. Now, this doesn't need too much explanation. If you go back and you think about the real push for human rights, it comes from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that emerged in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Holocaust, with political powers that victimized people. The second surge comes in the 1970s, in part as the horrors of Eastern Bloc communism started to emerge and become known. Many parts of Latin America in that period were swept by right-wing dictatorships. Needs little explanation or elaboration, but it gets more complex. Democratic context. One of the leading scholars of human rights today argues that human rights became the last utopia. It's what remained after other bigger hopes were dead. Instead of post-war reconstruction of social democracy, really true independence. Social and economic quality. society. In essence, the number of bodies that can hold up a policy change was correlated with greater inequality. You know? In other words, the more places a piece of legislation can get held up, the more inequality there is in the country. Just think about how many policies there are in our country, for example, that have majority support but never actually become law. For example, reasonable gun control. The immense majority of Americans want that, but it always ends up getting held up in Congress or declared unconstitutional, despite having majority support. Critical sociologist Robert Robinson has suggested that U.S. foreign policy has gone from gunboat diplomacy, whereby straightforward military might has been replaced by democracy promotion, through the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, and others. These are all institutions that are semi-autonomous parts of the United States government that provide funding for human rights around the world. So William Robinson has said that this is actually a new form of imperialism. You know, they try to export a certain type of democracy, polyarchic democracy, and free market capitalism. In other words, scholars critical of the current human rights regime suggest that left-leaning projects that seek to redress historical inequalities end up being stymied and undermined by human rights advocacy. This advocacy effectively prevents left governing projects from consolidating themselves and obliges a return to reduced liberal democracy and open markets. These scholars stop short of rejecting civil and political rights altogether, but point out that the current regime is preventing a broader pursuit of justice. As Samuel Moyn suggests in a book that will be coming out, or that recently came out, human rights are not enough. So what I would like to do here today is talk a bit about how these issues have played out in Venezuela, you know, during the years of Chavismo. I'll look at some of these dilemmas as well as some positive developments. I'm not going to provide any grand solutions to these dilemmas, but I'm going to provide sort of an inventory of what has been done to address them and the challenges that it leaves us with. And this is going to be kind of conceptual and scholarly, but I'm happy in the Q&A to talk about the general Venezuelan context. There's no problem at all. Okay, so first is the issue of instrumentalization of human rights advocacy. The past 20 years in Latin America has seen a development that nobody would have predicted 30 years ago. The emergence of left governing projects through democratic elections. Starting with the election of Hugo Chavez Frias in 1998, most of the major countries in the region elected leftist presidents of some stripe, including Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. Now we could add to that list Mexico. These governments generally tried to redress economic, social, and even cultural inequalities with state